Hello, Yakri here with another sort of podcast style game design video. I guess that's what I would call it. Although I particularly want to talk about multiplayer PvE games, right? Like co-op PvE games, I guess is what we could call it. In particular, about Warframe and a bit about Anthem, although that's not out yet, so I don't really have a lot of hours in it. But the topic I want to talk about that also kind of crosses over to games like World of Warcraft, MMOs in general, I'd say, the ones that aren't focused on PvP, is game balance in a PvE game. Like, let's say, I know like Warframe has its own PvP mode, World of Warcraft has a PvP mode, but let's pretend they don't exist because these games are focused on their PvE. That's the number one focus of the game, ostensibly, and where most of the balance changes come from. And so why does balance matter in these games? And I wanted to talk about this because I spend a lot of time reading forums and subreddits, although that's probably like a bad for my health type activity, honestly. Mental health at least. But I spend a lot of time on those sort of places, and I read a lot of comments about games, and it seems like every time there's a new game, like with Anthem coming out, there's a lot of comments from people saying, like, why do the developers have to balance PvE? Just leave it alone. Who cares if there's some silly OP shit? Just let us have fun with it. What does it really matter if there's no player versus player in the game? And it actually matters quite a lot, in my opinion. I don't know if I can really give you any super useful background. I guess it's my opinion as a long-time gamer and someone who's very interested in game design and probably spends an unhealthy amount of time watching like GDC videos and the like. But my experience has been that if you do not balance games in PvE, even single player games, even if we're talking about like Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen, I think that's a good example, right? A game like that, it's PvE, it's just single player. There's some multiplayer sort of co-op, but for the most part, it's basically a single player game. You need to balance these games because if you don't, players feel a pressure to use the best strategy, right? Especially, maybe not all players, but there's definitely a portion of players who are competitive, and they feel like if a strategy that they like is not very good, not very ideal for achieving things in the game, beating the game on the highest difficulty, or even just doing particularly well while beating the game on the highest difficulty, they may feel like they can't use it, and they need to go instead with the most powerful strategy. And if that strategy is not very fun for them, they're not going to like your game, is the reality of the situation. And this is a lot more important in multiplayer PvE games than single player ones. It's important in single player, like I said, but in multiplayer games, the thing is that you're with other people, right, playing the game. Typically, that's the intended experience for a game like Anthem, a game like Warframe. Single player is possible, of course, but the intended experience, the reason the game is designed the way it is in a lot of ways, in a lot of different areas, is so that you can play with your friends or with strangers and have a fun time playing with them. And if you feel totally worthless compared to the other players you're playing with, if you feel like you can't contribute and they're doing all the work, or they're doing really cool, impressive things and you can't do that, it feels bad. And that creates a much stronger sort of like peer pressure kind of force for you to play these highly effective builds. Now, the problem is that some portion of your player base is not going to enjoy the best, whatever the current best thing is. And so if they can't do well and be effective and have fun playing the second best and third best things, then you have a problem because they're going to feel like they have to play the first best thing or not play the game at all. And so what they will do is not play your game at all. And probably complain about it a lot online. So balance is really important because you have to make sure that on a couple levels. There's actually another thing I should really mention here before launching into any other spiel on the topic, which is that you have to balance also relative to the PvE content. So you have to, if you have like 4 classes, right? You have to balance those classes relative to each other, and they also have to be balanced relative to the content available. So if you have a boss fight, right, and it's supposed to be a challenge, right, and you leave in a build that makes it not a challenge, people are going to feel pressure to select that build, and they're going to play this boss fight, and the experience of the majority of your players will be that the boss fight isn't a challenge. And you'll have failed basically in the intention you had when you were creating that boss fight as a game designer, right? So you need to nerf that build, or because you can't, if you buff the boss fight, then you get this other problem where that build is now like mandatory to even have a chance, right? So you got to nerf the boss fight. Sorry, you got to nerf the build, not the boss fight, to make it a challenge with that build, and keep it a challenge with other builds, and also you need to make sure that it's not impossible for other builds. So you can bring that build down into line with other builds, and that's the first thing you have to do. And then if you feel that all the builds in the game, all the classes in the game have a pretty fair shot at that boss fight, and it's too hard, and then you can adjust the boss fight itself as needed, right? So that's pretty much what you got to do. And I guess I've already gone over why it's important. Maybe I could stop the video here, but I tend to like to ramble a lot too far. But the point is that you do need to have that balance between classes, and you need to have that balance between any particular class and the PvE content, so that it's the right amount of challenging, and that so that players you play with, your friends, just strangers, whoever, can't show you up, and so that you don't have a pressure as a player to play something other than whatever it is you find to be the most fun. Obviously, perhaps you can't always, accommodate absolutely everyone, and people will create weird, wacky, fun builds that aren't intended and aren't good, and you can't really realistically make them good, and that'll happen. But the point is that unfortunately, PvE balance is very important, even in games that are, cooperative. And PvE balance it's got to happen, right? You can't just leave in broken things for these reasons. Otherwise, you create problems in your game. And it does exist. And some people say like, oh, come on, Yakri. Warframe is so unbalanced. There's so much overpowered bullshit, right? It's so unbalanced compared to the PvE content. Well, I think Warframe actually does an okay job of balancing these things. They've certainly had some problems with it, and their whole game design ethos lends itself to power creep, and they've had problems with that as well. But they've done a pretty good job with it. Like, take Valkyrie, for example, right? So she has for those of you who don't play Warframe, she has an ultimate that makes her invulnerable. And, people have, it's a little more balanced now than it was in the past. But in the past, say, people have been able to keep that ultimate going indefinitely, right? It makes her do massive amounts of damage, and she's invulnerable. She can't die through any means. She's immune to all status effects. Just totally unstoppable, right? That seems like it's going to break your game design. The thing is that Warframe doesn't really have a lot of challenges where this is so important as to have a huge impact, because her ultimate doesn't let her kill everything on the map instantly. Her ultimate does not let her actually even kill a huge area of enemies very quickly. You have to kind of go through enemies like small groups and single enemies at a time, and so because the game is like a horde based shooter, and because there's so many enemies and you have to go through and kill them all, and there's so much emphasis on objectives and on killing enemies quickly, her ultimate helps. It's very good, but it's not like broken tiers of overpowered, right? It's not even, maybe not even in the top 10 most powerful abilities in the game, even in its older states when it was more broken, right? So that kind of gives you an idea of how they've set up this balance where for something to really be broken, it has to really just completely dominate gameplay like Mirage's old ultimate did, where you could stun the entire map of enemies, and on certain game modes, this would allow you to basically just go AFK. You could set a macro to recast your ultimate periodically, drop some energy pizzas once in a while, and on a decent efficiency build, you could just kind of not pay attention to the game for several minutes at a time at all, and you wouldn't even kill enemies. So, yeah. That sort of thing has gotten nerfed appropriately, I think, in the game. And yeah, I don't know, that kind of gives you a good idea of how they're doing that. And they do actually work on interframe balance, the balance between the different warframes in Warframe. So let's call them classes, right? So there's different classes in the game, especially for you non-Warframe players. And developers do work on balance between them. The balance between them isn't necessarily that good, and it is actually a problem, right? People don't want to play Hydroid, who's one of the worst frames in Warframe, and he was recently improved a lot, and he's still kind of bad, and he still doesn't see a lot of play because he's kind of bad, for a lot of reasons. Because of that pressure to do well in content, and because you don't want people in your party, to even the strangers, right, to be pissed off at you for picking something so useless as a class, right, so that you're not contributing, because it is a cooperative experience, right, and if you're not helping at all, people don't really appreciate that. If you're helping, if you're at least trying, people do appreciate it. And so it feels good to be helping your teammates, right, for most players, I assume. And so people don't want to play those weak, super weak frames. And so in that case, balance is, again, important. And it's important that warframes aren't so powerful that picking anything else seems worthless. Yeah, so that's kind of a reiteration of my points with some examples in Warframe. So the summary is that, yeah, balance in PvE-only games matters a lot. I don't think you can discard balance in PvE-only games. I do think there is one point to be made, and that is that there are cases where developers have gotten rid of fun stuff that didn't really need to be gotten rid of. I think one of the most classic examples, or to fix a very, very small problem, right? So in World of Warcraft, a long time ago, there was a sort of a bug that could allow you to kind of scale up cliffs, very steep cliffs, pretty easily. And in a couple specific places in the game, gold farmers from China would use this to take shortcuts through a dungeon and farm the dungeon very quickly. So Blizzard took and it was just like 1 or 2 dungeons. Blizzard took the what's the word I'm looking for here, like the steamroller approach instead of even hammering down a nail approach, and they completely removed this bug from the game. And the problem is that there are 2 aspects to this bug. One is it meant that terrain that you were intended to get up, you could pretty much always get up, because you could get up any kind of cliff, right? So if you're intended to get up it, no problem. If you're not intended to get up, maybe you can get up it still. And this allowed you to get to a lot of really beautiful places in the game. I mean, the game doesn't look that great graphically now, and it's been updated a lot. But back then, when the game released, it was very pretty, actually. And you could get to a lot of really cool places, and it really helped with the sense of adventure in the game, I would say. And developers completely removed it, and it was pretty bad initially, too, because there were a lot of ramps and hills and stuff that you were supposed to be able to perhaps get up, or that was just kind of like commonplace to go over and different routes through the game, and you couldn't do it anymore. You would slide off. And that sort of changes to gameplay are really irritating. One that's bugged me personally, but I can't really call it as much of a fuck up, would be perhaps in World of Tanks recently. They added a lot of invisible walls to prevent people from getting into overpowered positions on the map, instead of, say, designing maps without overpowered positions you can get into. What a crazy thought, right? And so if you aren't aware of which spots are magically sealed off, you can try and get up there, and then you hit a brick wall that's invisible, and you're stuck. Anyway, so the World of Warcraft example, though, they could have done something specifically for dungeons with these bugs in them to fix it just in those areas, and left it in for everyone else to explore and have fun. And they chose to just complete blanket remove it. And I think that was a mistake. I think there are other cases in games where developers have left in bugs like that have improved the entertainment value of the game. Been more like features, or just been fun and interesting, and didn't really need to be fixed. And I think it was a mistake. So in the same way, with things that actually affect balance, I think if it's not creating one of the problems I mentioned previously, then it is good to leave it alone, right? Weird, fun, unexpected combos, as long as they aren't breaking game balance, they're good to leave in. And I think perhaps if they are breaking game balance, but only through their numerical values, right, through the sheer power of the combination, why not bring it in line rather than remove it, even if it was unintended, provided players are actually enjoying it, So yeah, that sums up my views on the topic. I did manage to make this nice and appropriately Yakri long. It's probably like, what is this, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, something like that. Feels like that long. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Yakri out.